On August 17, 2026, Alex EALA walked into the third round of the Cincinnati Open against Amanda Anisimova, a legitimate top 10 player, a former Grand Slam finalist, someone with enough raw power to end a match in 20 minutes if she's playing clean. On paper, that's the kind of name that makes a young player's night. In reality, right now, it might be the other way around. Because EALA isn't arriving at this match as the underdog chasing an upset story. She's arriving as the hottest player in the sport, riding a run that started in Washington, kept building in Toronto, and just steamrolled straight through Cincinnati without her even needing to finish the previous match. Rus retired down 6-1, 3-0. That's not a scoreline, that's a surrender. So ask yourself the question everyone in tennis is quietly asking right now. Is this actually EALA's brutal test? Because rankings tell you where a player has been, they don't tell you where a player is right now, at this exact moment. And right now, the gap between where EALA's ranking says she should be and where her level actually is has never been wider. Rewind 3 weeks, because none of this makes sense without the full picture. In early August, EALA walked into the Mubadala City DC Open and left with her first WTA title, beating Naomi Osaka, beating Alina Svitolina, then closing it out against world number 3 Jessica Pegula in a final that swung from a dropped first set to a 6-0 bagel to finish it. That's not a lucky run through a weak draw. That's a player going through legitimate, ranked, dangerous opponents and coming out the other side every single time. Before that tournament even ended, tournament owner Mark Ein was telling reporters that roughly 80% of every ticket inquiry coming through the box office was some version of the same question: when is Alex EALA playing? Not questions about the tournament in general. Not questions about the bigger name seeds. Specifically her. That's the kind of demand signal that doesn't happen to a player still finding her footing. It happens to a player the public has already decided is must-watch. 48 hours later, she was in Toronto, and the story didn't slow down, it accelerated. She was originally slotted into the Grandstand Court, a 2,800-seat venue that made sense for her ranking at the time. It didn't make sense for her demand. Organizers moved her match to Center Court, all 12,500 seats of it, and it sold out in 30 minutes. Not over a day, not over an hour. 30 minutes for a mid-tier tournament stop, for a player who still didn't have a top 10 ranking to her name. And once she got on court, she didn't just play, she settled a score. Back in January, at the Australian Open, Alicia Parks had beaten her 0-6, 6-3, 6-2, a match that included a bagel set, the kind of scoreline that sits in a player's memory a lot longer than a normal loss does. In Toronto, 7 months later, EALA got her answer: 6-1, 4-6, 6-2. A tighter, tougher, 3-set battle this time, but the outcome flipped entirely. The specific player who'd bageled her in January walked off the court on the wrong end of the rematch. That's the DC to Toronto stretch. A title and a revenge win, back-to-back, 48 hours apart, against 3 different ranked opponents. And then came Cincinnati, where the story somehow found another gear. Seeded 17th, she got a first-round bye, which on its own tells you how far her ranking has already climbed. Waiting in round 2 was Elena Gabriela Rus, and this wasn't just any second-round matchup, it was personal. 2 years earlier, in 2024 US Open qualifying, Rus had beaten EALA 6-3, 1-6, 4-6, a result that kept her out of the main draw of a Grand Slam she's since made her home. 2 years is a long time in tennis when the player on one side of that rivalry goes from qualifying hopeful to WTA 500 champion. When they met again in Cincinnati, there was no drama, no 3-set battle, no storybook grind. EALA won the first set 6-1, was up 3-0 in the second, and Rus simply couldn't continue. Retired, gone. Book closed, and closed in the most emphatic way possible. Not just a win, but a statement that the gap between these two players is no longer close enough to produce a real fight. That's 4 matches. 4 different opponents. 4 different storylines, each with its own weight. A Grand Slam champion beaten in Osaka, a 2-time major finalist beaten in Svitolina, a former world number. #1 caliber talent in Pegula outlasted after dropping a set. A personal score settled against Parks. And now a 2-year-old ghost exercised against Roos without even needing a third set to do it. Every single one of those matches could have been the moment this run stalled out. Every single one of those matches instead became another chapter in it. Now, Anisimova. World number 10. A former U.S. Open finalist. A player with one of the flattest, most aggressive ball-striking games in the entire sport. Someone who, when everything clicks, can hit through opponents faster than almost anyone else on tour. That's not a name to dismiss, and nobody serious about tennis would tell you this is an easy match just because EALA'S been on a heater. Power like Anisimova's doesn't care about a winning streak. It doesn't care about momentum. It cares about whether her first serve is landing and whether her forehand is finding the lines. And when both of those things are working, she's capable of beating absolutely anyone in the world in straight sets. But here's the part that actually should worry Anisimova more than it worries EALA. Form doesn't lie, and right now, one of these two players is riding the best stretch of her career while the other has been searching for consistency. Reports out of the tennis world this season have flagged exactly that, Anisimova dealing with the kind of up-and-down form that comes from a talented, powerful player who hasn't quite found her rhythm for a full tournament in a while. That's not a permanent condition. Players like her can turn it on in a single match and make the rest of the draw look irrelevant. But walking into a third-round match against the player who currently has the most momentum of anyone left in that draw, against a player who has beaten a former world number 1, a top 3 ranked opponent, and closed out her last opponent so completely that the match didn't even finish. That's not the matchup you want if your own game hasn't been reliable lately. So why is this genuinely brutal for EALA, and not just a name on paper designed to sound scary? Because power neutralizes a lot of what's been working for her. Osaka, Svitolina, Pegula, Parks, Roos, different styles, different strengths, but none of them hit through the court with quite the same flat, explosive pace Anisimova brings on her best day. EALA'S counterpunching, her movement, her ability to extend rallies and make opponents play one more shot than they want to, all of that gets tested differently against someone who can end the point in 2 strokes instead of 8. If Anisimova's serve is landing and her forehand is finding depth, this becomes the first match of the run where EALA'S game plan has to adapt on the fly instead of simply executing what's already been working. And that's exactly what makes this third-round match so much bigger than its round number suggests. This isn't a final. It's not a marquee, headline-grabbing collision by seeding. But it's carrying the weight of an entire month's worth of momentum on one side, colliding directly with the one style of game that's genuinely capable of stopping that momentum cold on the other. Every match up to this point has tested a different part of EALA'S game: composure against Osaka, endurance against Svitolina, resilience after dropping a set against Pegula, redemption against Parks, dominance against Roos. This one tests something none of the others did: whether her game holds up against pure, unfiltered power, delivered by a player fully capable of imposing it if her form shows up on the right day. Think about what either outcome actually means once the scoreboard settles and both players start packing for New York, because this isn't the kind of result that simply gets filed away as a line score in a third-round match. This is a result that follows both of them onto the plane, into every pre-tournament press conference, into every commentator's storyline, heading into the year's final Grand Slam. If EALA beats Anisimova here, she doesn't just win another match in an already remarkable stretch. She walks into the US Open having beaten a former Grand Slam finalist and a current top 10 player in her very last tune-up before the tournament that matters most. That's not a minor addition to her resume. That's the single most complete case any player in this entire field will be able to make heading into New York, because it's not built on one good week or one lucky draw. It's built match by match, name by name, across 3 different countries in the span of barely 3 weeks. A WTA 500 title in Washington, a revenge win over the exact player who bageled her at the Australian Open, a merciless statement win over a 2-year-old rival who couldn't finish the match, and now, if it happens, a win over legitimate elite power in the form of Anisimova's flat, aggressive ball striking. That's not just confidence heading into a slam. That's proof, accumulated one contrasting style at a time, that there's no version of a tennis match, no surface pressure, no power profile, no emotional stakes, that's shown any consistent ability to trouble her this summer. And that distinction matters more than it might seem to on the surface. Confidence is something a player tells herself. Proof is something the results already established before she ever steps onto Arthur Ashe. A player walking into a grand slam on confidence alone is hoping the feeling holds up under pressure. A player walking in with this kind of accumulated evidence isn't hoping. She's simply continuing a pattern that's already survived 5 different tests, 5 different opponents, 5 different ways a match could have gone wrong and didn't. That's the version of EALA who would be walking into New York if this one falls her way, and it's about as close to a fully armored mental state as professional tennis ever produces heading into its biggest stage. Now flip it, because the loss scenario deserves just as much honesty as the win scenario, without either overstating the damage or pretending it wouldn't matter at all. If she loses, nothing about the run before this match gets erased. Washington still happened. The title is real, it's on the record, it doesn't disappear because of what happens in one Cincinnati match. Toronto still happened. The revenge win over Parks, the sold-out center court, all of it stays exactly as real as it was the day it occurred. The demolition of Ruse still happened, still ends with a retirement at 6-1, 3-0, still closes a 2-year-old chapter in the most emphatic way it possibly could. None of that gets rewritten by a loss to Anisimova. But something else happens instead, something quieter and more specific than a simple setback. She'd be walking into the US Open having just been personally reminded, in the most direct way the sport can deliver a reminder, that raw power when it's landing, when the serve is finding corners and the forehand is finding lines, remains the one variable her game hasn't fully proven it can consistently solve this summer. Not a disaster, not a crisis, nothing that undoes a single result that came before it. But not the perfect, unblemished momentum story this month could have finished as, either. There's a real difference between a 5-tournament run with 0 question marks attached and a 5-tournament run with exactly 1, and that difference is precisely what's on the table heading into this match. And for Anisimova, the stakes cut just as sharply, just as specifically, in the opposite direction. Because this match isn't only about what it means for EALA. A win here would be the kind of result that resets an entire narrative around Anisimova's season, all at once, in a single afternoon. It would be proof, delivered on the exact stage where it matters most, that the power everyone knows she has is still there, still lethal, still fully capable of shutting down the tour's hottest, most talked-about storyline before it ever reaches New York. That's not a small thing for a player who spent portions of this season fighting inconsistency questions. A win over the player everyone in tennis has been talking about for 3 straight weeks doesn't just add a checkmark to a results sheet, it becomes the headline of her own season, the answer to every question anyone's been asking about her form lately. But a loss, especially a comprehensive one, especially one that looks anything like what happened to Ruse, would mean something considerably heavier than just one more defeat added to a season schedule that already has plenty of them. It would mean losing to a player who has now beaten 5 different ranked opponents in roughly 3 weeks: Osaka, Svitolina, Pegula, Parks, Ruse, and potentially Anisimova herself if the result falls that way. A stretch that's rapidly stopped looking like one hot month and started looking like a fundamental shift in where a player actually belongs in the sport's hierarchy. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A hot month is something the tour sees constantly. A player catches fire for 2 or 3 weeks, beats a few names above her ranking, and then regresses back toward wherever the numbers said she belonged all along. Nobody restructures how they think about a player based on a hot month. But 5 ranked wins across 3 different countries, against 5 completely different playing styles, stops being explainable as a heater and starts looking like evidence of an actual level shift. The kind that forces analysts, opponents, and eventually rankings algorithms to admit the player standing in front of them isn't temporarily good. She's simply arrived. And it would extend exactly the kind of inconsistency questions that have already been trailing Anisimova's season for months now, adding one more data point to a growing pile instead of finally putting the conversation to rest the way a win here would. That's not a small distinction either. Every player carries some version of a season-long narrative that follows her from tournament to tournament, and for Anisimova, that narrative right now is built around unpredictability, dangerous on her best day, vulnerable on her worst, with not enough matches recently landing clearly on one side or the other. A dominant win over the tour's hottest player would have been the cleanest possible answer to that narrative, proof delivered on the largest possible stage that the power is reliable again. A loss does the opposite. It doesn't just fail to answer the question. It actively deepens it, handing critics and commentators one more example to point to the next time her form gets discussed heading into a big tournament. That's the real trouble sitting underneath this matchup, the trouble the title is actually pointing at, once you look past the surface-level power ranking that would normally make Anisimova the assumed favorite. It's not simply whether Anisimova loses one match to a player she's technically ranked above on paper. Rankings lose matches to lower-ranked players constantly in tennis. That alone rarely means much on its own. It's what a loss like this would specifically say, publicly, immediately, and repeatedly across every recap and highlight package covering it, about where her game actually stands right now, against a player nobody outside the Philippines was seriously talking about a month ago, and who half the tennis world has now spent 3 consecutive weeks watching cover one ranked opponent after another. Losing to a rising in-form player carries a very different kind of weight than losing to someone whose ranking justified the result all along. One of those losses fades quickly, the other lingers, gets replayed, gets referenced every time the next tough draw comes around. So here's what actually decides this one, stripped down past the storylines, past the rankings, past every pre-match narrative currently circulating, down to the 2 specific questions that determine everything else that happens on that court. Does EALA'S counterpunching, the movement, the court coverage, the clutch composure that carried her through a dropped opening set against Pegula and through a personal, emotionally loaded grudge match against Parks, hold up against a player capable of ending points in 2 shots instead of 8? That's not a small ask, and it shouldn't be treated like one just because of how well this month has gone so far. Everything that's worked for EALA this month has worked partly because her opponents allowed time inside the points, time to extend rallies, time to force one more shot than an opponent wanted to hit, time for her legs and her patience to eventually wear someone down. Anisimova, on her best day, simply doesn't give anyone that kind of time. She takes it away early, flattens the ball through the court, and finishes points before a counterpuncher's usual patterns ever get the chance to develop or take hold. Does Anisimova's raw power finally find the target on the exact day it matters most, reminding an entire tennis world that a 5-match win streak, however dominant it's looked stacked up on paper across 3 different countries, ultimately means nothing against a ball striker who's fully switched on and finding her spots? That question deserves to sit for a second before moving past it, because it's easy to treat win streaks as some kind of accumulating shield, as if enough good results in a row eventually make a player immune to whatever's coming next. Tennis doesn't work that way, and every player who's ever ridden a hot streak into a bad matchup already knows it. Momentum carries a player through matches where the questions being asked of her game are questions she's already answered, questions about composure, about grinding through a dropped set, about handling a personal, emotionally loaded rematch. It doesn't automatically carry her through a completely different question, one her recent opponents simply weren't equipped to ask. And Anisimova, when her game is fully online, asks a question none of the last 5 opponents asked: can you handle a ball that's already past you before your usual patterns even get the chance to start working? Because that's really the tension sitting inside every single point of this match, underneath all the surrounding storylines about tickets, sponsorships, viral interview clips, and everything else that's turned this into a season-defining month for one side of the net. Strip away the ticket demand headlines. Strip away the Marriott deal. Strip away the interview clip that made people who don't even follow tennis stop and feel something. None of that decides a single point once the match actually starts. What decides it is far narrower and far more mechanical than any storyline. whether EALA'S shape inside a rally holds up against shots that arrive with less time to react, and whether Anisimova's own execution, her serve percentage, her depth, her willingness to take risks on the biggest points, actually shows up the way it can on her best days. It's not just about who wins today as a simple scoreline on a results page that gets forgotten within a week. It's about whether this entire run has actually built something durable enough to survive the one specific style of game that's built, almost by design, to end runs exactly like it, or whether raw power, on the one day it finally shows up fully switched on, still beats everything else the sport currently has to offer against it, no matter how good the last 3 weeks have looked on paper. Drop your prediction for how this one actually goes, and don't hedge on it the way commentary usually does, sitting safely in the middle so nobody can be proven wrong later. Pick a side and commit to it. Do you think EALA'S momentum, her composure, and her ability to grind through pressure carries her through in 2 tight sets, the same way it did against Parks in Toronto, where a dropped middle set didn't shake her, and she found a way to close it out anyway? That's the version of this prediction that leans on everything already proven. 5 matches, 5 different styles, 0 cracks yet. Or does Anisimova's power finally show up on the exact day everyone's quietly been waiting for it to, turning this into the first real speed bump of an otherwise flawless month, the kind of result that doesn't erase what came before it but does put a real asterisk next to it heading into New York? That's the version of this prediction that respects exactly how dangerous a fully switched-on top 10 ball striker actually is, regardless of what the opponent across the net has done in the weeks leading up to it. Both outcomes are sitting right there on the table, equally plausible, depending entirely on which version of Anisimova actually walks onto that court, the inconsistent one that's shown up for uneven stretches of this season, the one that's given opponents openings she wouldn't have given a year ago, or the fully switched-on one, the one still capable of beating literally anyone in the world on a given afternoon when her serve and her forehand both decide to cooperate at the same time. And stick around, because whichever way this breaks, it's going to answer the one question that's followed this entire run since Washington first started it. The question every recap, every highlight package, and every pre-US Open storyline is quietly building toward, without saying it outright. Is this a player who's simply better right now than everyone she's faced so far? Full stop. No qualifiers attached, no asterisks about weaker fields or favorable draws. Or is this a player who's about to find out exactly where the ceiling actually sits, 2 weeks before the single biggest tournament of the year, against the one style of opponent specifically built to test it in a way none of the previous 5 did? Either way, by the time this match ends, we're going to know considerably more about what kind of player is about to walk into Arthur Ashe Stadium than we do right now, sitting on this side of it with nothing but predictions and past results to go on. And whatever that answer turns out to be, whichever way the scoreline actually breaks, it's not going to stay quiet for long. Not with everything else already riding on her name this summer, not with an entire tennis world already watching every single thing she does, on and off the court, closer than it's watched any other rising player in years.